that if you burden people too much with narrow and fierce and highly emotive styles of religion that dichotomize in-groups from out-groups and make a fuss over intrinsically lesser issues, you're actually going to repel more people than you attract. And the kind of people you attract may be troubled youth anyway, who very often populate these sort of marginal, hyper-fundamentalist traditions. And the consequence of that may well be, in the long term, secularization. Because religion becomes so hard and harsh that people eventually burn out and walk away from it.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the last episode of Kindred Stories for 2024. Shara, we've had 12 episodes this year, roughly one a month, but it didn't work out one a month. We've had 2 episodes this month alone. What are your reflections on our first year in Kindred Stories?
It's been great, alhamdulillah. This was our second podcast. We've got 3 or 4 now, basically. Different brands that we do either individually or together. This one is very different from the rest in the sense that
It's personal.
it's personal. I think we are, I don't want to speak for you, but for me, this is where I'm most vulnerable. This is where I'm most willing to learn and be open about my own shortcomings. And I come out of most of these conversations enriched, and that's more than I can say about the others.
And the comments that we get from listeners of Kindred Stories are very different from what we get for Keluar Sekejap, our political podcast, which is normally more animated, more unvarnished. This one's more introspective, reflective.
I think that reflects the tone of the conversations we have and the approach that you and I take to this one in particular.
I know you're very excited about this episode.
I am.
Because you actually...
I'm a fan of this person.
I know you're a fan of
I
this
know
person,
he
as
won't
I
be
am,
comfortable.
but you also spent some time at the institution that was founded by our esteemed guest today.
That's
Maybe
right.
you want to tell us a little bit about the time that you spent in Cambridge.
So he wouldn't know. I went to just look at the place, Cambridge Muslim College, which gives away now who our guest is, and also spent time at the Cambridge Mosque, which is a eco-friendly mosque. It's quite an experience. It's not large in a sense that maybe some of the KL mosques that we're familiar with is, but going in, there's a sense of serenity that I would say rivals anything we have here. And that's quite an experience to feel that far away from home, Cambridge versus Kuala Lumpur.
And was that architecture of the mosque
It's beautiful.
Arabic, or was it inspired by any particular geographical location?
I hesitate to answer now that our guest is in front of me, but I didn't feel like it particularly reflected any sort of imported culture.
Okay.
It felt a bit more, I don't know if it was Cambridge or local in any sense, but it didn't feel like I was going into a Pakistani mosque or a Bangladeshi mosque or an Arabic mosque per se, but I shouldn't answer too long about this because he can tell us better. We should ask him
himself. But it is a topic of discussion even here in Malaysia, where
how we inspire.
Absolutely. If you look at the National Mosque, it was uniquely designed to be a Malaysian mosque.
I think that's about right.
And if you look at some of the other mosques that have been built in Malaysia, of course, the Moorish and Arabic traditions come through a bit more. So given that you have spent a bit of time in Cambridge, at the Cambridge Muslim College, I will give you the honor to introduce our guest today.
Our guest today is none other than Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, aka Timothy Winter. Sheikh, welcome to Kindred Stories.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the encounter.
How many times have you been to Malaysia and to KL actually?
Countless times. Probably for the best part of 25 years I've been coming here.
And in your travels to Kuala Lumpur, have you, over the last 25 years, have you sensed any change in your engagement with the people here, or has it always been quite similar?
Well, my gaze is necessarily the superficial one of the casual traveller. So my judgment is probably of little sort of real moment. But I noticed that there are fewer sarongs and more skyscrapers, if there's a correlation between those two. It's somewhat different atmospheric in the mosques and at Friday sermons. The inevitable progress of what we tend to call globalization, whether one likes it or not. but in a space that's already, for centuries, been multiple and cosmopolitan, unlike England or the top left-hand corner of Europe really is very historically monolithic as a single white Christian, Catholic or Protestant culture. And our experience of cosmopolitanism and plurality is really historically very recent, whereas here it goes back to the Malacca Sultanate and partly because of the geography, the Maritime Silk Road, Chinese communities, South Indian communities, Malay communities, indigenous communities, and so many others, Arab communities, interacting, intermarrying, and creating a depth to a cosmopolitanism here, which we're still struggling to create in the European context. And that means that the impact of globalization and the plurality which it brings is, I think, softer here than in the United Kingdom, because every street in Penang has always been multiple. The kinds of food available, the traditions have always been colourfully diverse. Whereas until 50 years ago, the English high street was tediously grey and monochrome, and there was the fish and chips, and there was the post office, and there was the policeman on his bicycle, and it was always the same. So we're struggling a little bit more, I think, with globalization than people are with more historically diverse cultures, such as the Nusantara.
Sheikh Hakim, we'll come to the multiculturalism in Europe and in the UK in a bit. But your observation of less sarongs and more skyscrapers is actually less of a superficial observation than you make it out to be. One thing that many people who've been to Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur over the last 2 or 3 decades would have noticed is, of course, changes in how people dress here. And that speaks to a certain rise in the form of religious conformity, or at least religiosity amongst the Muslims in Malaysia. So one thing that people would observe, had they been here in the 1980s compared to now, of course, is the more ubiquitous use of headscarves or hijab among women. But at the same time, we've received this tremendous influx of investment, of tourism, of modernity, globalization, call it what you like. There are tensions here, and there are tensions in other parts of the Muslim world. Have you seen this tension among Muslims of how to deal with this increased religious consciousness, religiosity, at the same time subscribing towards this globalized world, this world in which we are modern, or for want of a better term, modernity? What are the tensions there before we deep dive into some specific questions?
Well, diversification is something that Islam has always been quite good at dealing with. The cosmopolitan or metropolitan capitals of the great Islamic empires historically were always bafflingly and amazingly diverse. And yet that diversity sustained quite strong dynastic and imperial and educational structures for centuries. The Ottoman Empire lasted for 5 centuries, the British Empire for less than a century. So the classical Islamic world, in its strategies of diversity management, generally can be considered a success story. So increasing diversity, I don't think, is a challenge or a risk. In fact, it should be welcomed. The problem is the loss of diversity caused through not only the globalized monoculture that makes every building and every movie and every plot line and every pair of trousers and every car more or less the same universally, which is a very serious loss of, as it were, cultural biodiversity, but also the homogenizing of the religious discourse, the loss of local narratives, the loss of local instantiations of the sacred in time and in space, the loss of a symbiosis between the indigenous and the monotheistically universal. And I think that's a kind of loss of diversity which parallels globalization's confiscation of diversity, and the two in tandem, they're really part of the same phenomenon, and they're born by the same media, first print media, and then television, radio, and now the internet tend to homogenize us and do away with local difference. That the collaboration of the fundamentalizing of Islam with the uniformity of the modern style is, I think, something that is genuinely threatening and pushes back against the diversification which increasing communication appears to bring.
You speak about the homogenizing of religion and in particular of Islam, Sheikh. I think in Malaysia too, and in other places in the East, we are grappling with that in the sense where in countries like Malaysia, where there is a bureaucratization of Islam and the state is intertwined, there are debates currently happening about what should the guardrails be to define what Islamic practice is and which mazhab and which theology school we should abide by. Does this go against your sense of the diversification and diversity of the practice of Islam?
And just to put that into context, Sheikh, there still is an active debate in Malaysia today. Just to bring this to the international audience, there was a bill in Parliament that has been laid down to the MPs, where the appointment of the federal mufti has been narrowed down to somebody who practices or prescribes exclusively to the theology of Ash'ari and Maturidi. And that was seen, as Sharil said, to be the institutionalizing or bureaucratizing of faith that perhaps challenges that diversity that you mentioned.
I am not equipped to deal with the particularities of the situation here, still less with its political inevitable and quite legitimate political context. I would observe, however, that very often this curating by state authority of particular religious normativities cannot be detached from the perception of Islam in terms of a security risk. Brunei, for instance, I've had the pleasure of visiting several times, has quite severe rules about what is and is not normative Islam. And an increasing number of Muslim countries are adopting the same policy, largely to identify and to squeeze out the conventionally termed Salafistic or Wahhabi perspectives, which are perceived as being the kind of conveyor belt into extremism and fundamentalism. And certainly, the discourse has become quite acute in the Middle East, much more than it is here, where in Saudi Arabia, which I visited last month, there is a kind of mass jumping back from the traditional Salafi Wahhabi discourse. The Islamic university curricula are being reconfigured to incorporate more traditional materials. The dichotomizing of society and the world in terms of in and out groups, which often characterize those groups, is being played down. And the reason for this, I suspect, is not that elite figures in that culture have deeply reflected upon the nature of true religion, but that the whole world has alerted them to the fact that in every case, terroristic activity is identified with purveyors of this Salafistic, Wahhabistic fundamentalism. Of course, they're not all terrorists by any means, but there does seem to be a synergy. All of the violent Islamist attacks that we've had in Western Europe recently have been identified with that particular aqidah. So I suspect that that's the deeper reason why there is a narrowing of the episteme, and some often quite harmless fundamentalist groups are finding themselves under pressure because of the association of that particular point of view with political violence and intolerance.
You speak about it from the perspective of security. You've also spoken about some of these schools of thought as promoting what is authentic to be very narrow and uncompromising, making religion difficult. And I remember you said previously it was as though Allah created the universe to catch us out. What are your thoughts about this narrowing of this view, to the extent that the most uncompromising, the most strict view is one that is correct or authentic?
Students of fundamentalism who tend to be more involved in the psychology than in the sociology of religion frequently identify fundamentalism or kind of rigorist movements as reactions against modernity on behalf of individuals who feel a threat to their identity and to the familiar landmarks of their world. And in order to push back against that confiscation of identity, they fearfully retreat into the narrowest and most uncompromising interpretation that they think they can find. and frequently myself dealing with various individuals who've been attracted to that point of view, it's clear that at least half of the reasons that they deploy are to do with fearfulness and anxiety about the changing of the world and the secularization of the world and the profaning of their traditional forms of life. And you find this not just in the Islamic context, but the growth of nativism and religious integrism, for instance, in the South Asian context. In the Hindu tradition is so impossibly diverse and has such a distinctive view of scripturality that it's hard to imagine how anything like a kind of uniform ideology could ever be made out of it, let alone one that creates in-groups and out-groups and becomes the basis for a religious nationalism. But somehow they've managed to create that.
So what should the correct response, Muslim response, be to this fear of modernity? What is the convivial way of dealing with, of being with modernity?
The traditional scholars with whom I have historically studied have tended to the view that what is required in a time such as ours is the mobilization of our best resources for flexibly but authentically dealing with contemporary challenges in a way that makes things easier for people who are weaker than they've ever been before. Human weakness is kind of a theological given. The Quran says man is created weak. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. And in an age such as ours, with more temptations and more distractions and more intellectual scientific challenges than religion has ever faced before, to assume that the correct response to religion is to charge into the narrowest possible interpretation, or even to impose that interpretation on everybody through some kind of totalitarian utopian religious state, is the exact opposite of what the kind of authentic tradition of Muslim wisdom and what we find in the libraries would be. Generally, the traditional sheikhs, seeing the complexities that face young people, the pressures that they're under, will find easier solutions for them that are not completely out of bounds in terms of what's possible and not possible in the sort of large gamut of the sea of responses that the Sharia has historically evolved. And there's plenty of prophetic precedent for this. بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا مُيَسِّرًا. I have been sent as a teacher and somebody who makes things easier. بَشِّرُوا وَلَا تُنَفِّرُوا يَسِّرُوا وَلَا تُعَسِّرُوا. It's another well-known sound hadith. Give people good news, don't repel them, make things easy for them, don't make things difficult for them. And that is not just kind of prophetic scriptural instruction, but it's kind of common sense in a time such as ours, that if you burden people too much with narrow and fierce and highly emotive styles of religion that dichotomize in-groups from out-groups and make a fuss over intrinsically lesser issues, you're actually going to repel more people than you attract. And the kind of people you attract may be troubled youth anyway, who very often populate these sort of marginal hyper-fundamentalist traditions. And the consequence of that may well be, in the long term, secularization. Because religion becomes so hard and harsh that people eventually burn out and walk away from it, which is part of everybody's history in England. We had Cromwell's Commonwealth, 11 years of extreme Puritan strictness, regulations on everything. Even Christmas they banned because it was an innovation. And they thought they would create a kind of perfect Christian Commonwealth. After 11 years, people had had enough. And we had Charles II, and we had an epoch of music, and the Newmarket races were started up, and gambling became a thing, and the King's mistress were Nell Gwynn, and it was it was party time again. And we're starting to see this in some Muslim countries, that the fundamentalists burn out after a while. So those who think that the solution is through narrower interpretations and through making life harder for people may end up not getting what they expected. And I think that, unfortunately, many Muslim countries are going to learn this the hard way.
Yeah, I think your last couple of answers leads me quite easily to my series of questions about secularism. Because I'm sure people watching this podcast, some will still feel some enamor towards secularism, towards the modern secular. I think both Kyrie and I have had both our present and our past being intertwined with that as well. But I wonder if you could explain what evidence you see that there is a crisis of secularism today.
It's very generally remarked amongst sort of more popularizing philosophers. John Gray, for instance, at LSE has a series of books such as Straw Dogs, in which he talks about the fatigue of secularity, the fact that that which was intrinsic to human meaning-making since the old Stone Age has, within living memory, been confiscated or relegated to marginal activities. And it's not clear how well the species can thrive in its absence. Nobody really knows. But many will point to the mental health pandemic, to certain collapses in human sociality, to a generalized sense of lassitude in society. So they speak of the fatigue of secularity, that the excitement of the void, which was the energizing principle of so much contemporary fiction and theatre and art, the excitement of contemplating the huge space vacated by religion, which is a very kind of vertiginous, energizing principle for the 20th century. People are getting a little bit tired of vertiginously standing at the edge of nothing and are starting to wonder whether there could be something, even if it's not the something that was once in that space. Other critics would be people like Alain de Botton, Camille Paglia, the feminist writer. It's quite a standard trope, Martha Nussbaum, the American philosopher, that we are existing in a time of a slackening or a crisis of modernism. Jürgen Habermas, the last of the Frankfurt School, has said modernism is dominant but dead. Everything is modern, but the ideologies which once generated it and supported it there are no ideologies any longer. The Frankfurt School was supposedly an offshoot of a certain type of Marxism. That is quite hard to sustain philosophically and ethically nowadays. Nationalism had its heyday in Europe and turned into the worst nightmare in human history. It's not clear where people go if they actually want a secularity that's based on some kind of philosophical belief system, rather than just the fact that there is an end of ideology and there's nothing to believe any longer, so we might as well pragmatically and transactionally get on with our lives, which for many is the sign of a civilization in a state of failure and presents quite extreme forms of precarity, producing wild mood swings in the electorate, which we've seen across the board in Western electorates with the collapse of traditional parties, the conservative versus the reformist. It's now kind of Trump versus Harris, both kind of exaggerated caricatures of what those people would have been a generation or two ago. And you have yesterday's collapse of the French government with Barnier's failure to push through his budget. And the very strange circumstance there that nobody votes for traditional parties, but you have a coalition between Mélenchon, who's really on the hard left, and then you have the kind of centre-right, which Barnier is supposed to represent, and then Macron trying desperately to hold the farmyard together from his presidential position. And the only point of that coalition is to keep out the new kid on the block, which is the Islamophobic nativist phenomenon of the national rally of Marine Le Pen. All of this would have been very strange and unbelievable a generation ago, and is because of the absence of ideology.
What about the liberal pushback to that, saying that Trump, the dysfunctional governments in Western democracies, these are aberrations? But surely there is moral value in the liberal belief of private property, human rights, individual liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. Surely that is, those are values.
Oh, certainly. And to the extent that the structures developed after the Second World War that attempted to put their universal aspirations into practice have survived. You see, for instance, in response to the Palestine crisis, very bravely, the old-fashioned human rights institutions, Amnesty International, the International Court of Justice, and so forth, coming up with a discourse that is profoundly unpalatable to global elites. But nonetheless, that traditional idea of the universal human rights is still valid for very many liberals. The problem is, however, whether there is a philosophy or an ideology, still less a theology, that really underpins it. Is it just an inertia that's keeping it going, or does it have an internal dynamic that actually is technical terms, Kantian or post-Kantian, that actually provides reasons for virtue rather than a horror about its absence? That's the difficult question at the moment.
If there is a crisis of secularity, which I think all of us agree there is, why is Islam or religion more broadly the answer to it, and not a return or a push towards a Trumpian, anti-woke, anti-liberal culture?
Well, the extent to which Trump's core electorate is actually motivated by something that looks like Bible Belt Christianity or not is kind of up for grabs. But the white evangelicals probably represent his core constituency. 85% of white evangelicals vote for Trump. So it's not a secular reaction. But it's complexly secular and religious, I would say, in the very strange American Christian world of gun lobby, Bible-believing, pro-Israel, sort of anti-environmentalist, anti-NATO gospel-believing Christianity. It's historically a very strange thing. And the prosperity gospel, which is one of the strangest aberrations in religious history, but is now sweeping the board in the mega churches. So it is an epiphenomenon of that type of very American identity Christianity, which we don't really have an equivalent to in Europe, where the nativist movements tend to refer to religion, but where they're generally opposed by the churches. So in Austria, Italy, France, where anti-immigration sentiment is strong, the Catholic Church in particular tends to be very supportive of refugees, asylum seekers, and so forth, and can't really be mobilized for the new kind of sort of sub-fascistic discourses that are appearing. So it's different depending on which side of the Atlantic you're standing on. But the deeper question is, the one that somebody like John Gray raises as an atheist. He's not sure whether the sense of the numinous, the perception of the magical luminosity and transcendence of things that Paleolithic humanity detects in the middle of the forest, and which colors every aspect of life, including relationships, death ceremonies, births, contracts, going to war, kingship, everything has been determined by an awareness of the sacred. Whether that is so intrinsic to our humanity, perhaps even an aspect of evolution for the evolutionary biologist, an important aspect of human psychological flourishing, reproduction, survival, that in its absence the species can't actually function correctly. Nobody really knows the answer to that, because there's a lot of neuroplasticity up here, and we can adapt to living in a concrete jungle rather than just a sort of a biotic jungle. We can do it. We're a very versatile species. But is there a point beyond which we really start to malfunction? Nobody knows the answer to that. But we're already seeing species-wide dysfunction, not just in terms of the sort of mental health pandemic amongst young people, young women in particular, but also through the collapse in the birth rate. If the secularists are saying all we are is the consequence of a billion years of natural selection and random mutation and the selfish gene, and there's no ethics or transcendence or God or anything in that, and all we are machines for reproduction, then on that hard materialistic view, the species is really heading for categoric dysfunction, because the birth rate everywhere is tanking. In England, it's 1.4 babies per mother. In South Korea, it's half of that. And these are going to lead to economic and social collapse within a generation or two. And it's not clear how you reverse that. So even from a secular point of view, the absence of the sacred and the generally sort of high fertility rates associated with religious communities suggest that secularity has to be careful what it asks for, I think.
I guess my question, Shaykh, to just extend that, it really stems from my sense, and I'm sure this is simplified. You have at this moment a crisis of secularity where perhaps I've heard you speak that it's the end of the Enlightenment, and or at least this is where Enlightenment has got us, this point of plurality to the point of lack of meaning. Then you've got religion on the other end of the spectrum. But somewhere in the middle are folks like Andrew Tate, are folks like hyper-masculinity striking back. My question is, as people of faith, how do we make sure that there is no stop in between I guess those two extreme, if you understand.
Yeah, I'm not sure that faith and secularity are extremes. I would say that, by all historical standards, faith is the kind of norm, and fundamentalism is an extreme, atheism is another extreme, and human normalcy, which has always been focused on the sacred, is kind of a messy area in the middle. Nowadays, they have been polarized in this way, I suppose, at least in the eyes of many. And the kind of high-octane, hyper-masculine manosphere world, which is now very widely followed, and a certain feminine equivalent, represents the consequence of the loss of a traditional balance. Masculinity in its fullness, to be seen in traditional societies, is not associated with egotism and with self-vaunting, but actually with service and humility. If you look at the coronation service of any monarch, East or West, you'll see that it is actually about overcoming personal preferences and a life of dedication to service. It's not about kind of, here I am, and my male grooming products and this nonsense. Working out, all of that is to do with a kind of vanity that all traditional cultures, I think, uniformly would despise. So this kind of hypertrophic masculinity, I think, and also feminine equivalents are an expression, usually quite an unhappy expression, I think, of a society that has lost sight of traditional balance and is producing these extremes. The incel movement, for instance, which is not as big in England as it is in America, but in North America, incel ideologies are the principal source of violent events that are classified as terroristic. It's not some religious thing. It comes from the incels, who are usually a secular type of movement, and that continues to increase with mass school shootings and mall murders and so forth happening almost daily now in the United States. So people can quite rightly point to religious aberrations and suicide bombings and all of the rest of that sorry story. But in Western democracies, increasingly, the principal source of terroristic antisocial behavior actually comes from these extreme, very modern movements, such as incels. And there's no sign that there's anything in the secular dynamic at the moment that can actually, on its own terms, start to calm that down. Where is the countervailing discourse?
We'll take a quick break on that note and come back after this. Welcome back to this episode of Kindred Stories with Dr. Timothy Winter, also known as Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, who is the founder of Cambridge Muslim College, the UK's premier institution of Islamic learning and research. Educated at Cambridge and also Al-Azhar, he is the author of several books, including the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology, and is also a fellow and director of studies at Wolfson College, Cambridge. Sheikh, we've had a very extensive discussion on Islam and modernity. I want to bring in a debate on technology in a bit, and what Islam can provide in terms of the preparation of what some people have spoken of as a technological singularity moment, as perhaps the end point of evolution. But before we go there, maybe to simplify the discussion that I think Sharil sparked just before we went on the break. This is to speak of the meaning or the purpose of existence. And I think a lot of young Muslims who listen to Kindred Stories always come to our podcast to find some meaning. And this is, of course, sometimes terribly unstructured, ephemeral, but they do listen to try to figure out what is their purpose of being, and to juxtapose that with, I suppose, meaningless evolution, this selfish gene where morality is a social construct, where we live in a world of consumption, of self-desire, autonomy. What would your message to a young Muslim be who's confronted with this world where the West celebrates this autonomy, celebrates this self-desire, this egoism? What can Islam offer that young person?
Well, most of the answer, I guess, is shared with other religious traditions. and has been shared probably for at least a century, because modernity is not a new thing in the Muslim world. It goes back 150, 200 years with the first impingement of European armies and the realization by traditional Muslim cultures and their elites that they were no longer top dog in the clash of civilizations. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the Muslim discourse tended to be rather more frantic, I would say, than it is today, partly because modernity, in the heyday of empire, for instance, was much more triumphalistic than it's become today. Muhammad Abdal, people in India like Chiragh Ali, Sir Said Ahmed Khan, and no doubt similar thinkers in this part of the Muslim world, were confronting something that seemed to be overwhelmingly successful and to have answered, at least functionally, the questions about human organization and human progress. And the Muslims seem to be forced into a kind of apologetic or defensive mode. I think the situation is a little easier for us now, because the West is clearly reflecting on some of the consequences of its hypermodernity, certain existential threats which would have been undreamt of by kind of colonial district commissioners in Penang 100 years ago, where everything was, the white man was the climax of evolution. It began with the amoeba and ended up with kind of pink people playing cricket, and it was that was the universal view that they had, a kind of linear progress leading to the Englishman. That's really no longer adhered to, because modernity so undeniably has run into catastrophes in the 20th century. So everything today is still kind of post-Holocaust. Germany was the most educated of the Western countries. The Nazi movement was deeply embedded in Germany's universities and amongst German philosophers and scientists. It was really a mass movement, particularly amongst the middle classes and the educated classes, and it produced the worst history the world has ever seen. So there's a certain slackening, as Heidegger said, a certain kind of slackening Gelassenheit after the war, when the old excited triumphalistic discourse of progress ran into the buffers and we're all kind of wondering what went wrong. The socialistic experiments ran into the buffers some sort of 3 or 4 decades later. So the very sort of messianic utilizations of philosophy, secularity, science, technology, in order to usher in a secular utopia, turned out to produce horrible dystopias. So there's a certain sort of chastening of Western triumphalism that's taken place. And more recently, with the collapse of the Kantian model in philosophy and the move to postmodern deconstruction, the whole point of deconstruction is that the Enlightenment and the whole Western narrative of we're getting better, and this is the projection into the social realm of biological evolutionary processes, and hey, it's us and everybody else has to catch up with our values. It's a kind of colonial triumphalism, is now really no longer sustainable. And the technologies are the third thing, which demonstrably are making us a little bit more comfortable every year, but are also threatening us with total wipeout a little bit more every year. The Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, which has this famous doomsday clock in Chicago, has now set the hour, it's like 2 minutes to midnight now, their judgment of the global situation. And the most likely scenario for a great power confrontation is a nuclear exchange through a mistake or not a mistake. The fact that that almost happened in 1962 with the Cuba crisis and various other misfires and exercises that went wrong. There are books all about moments when, through human error, Armageddon almost took place, and we're kind of lucky or spared by Providence just to be talking here now. So the nuclear chastening, climate change, of course, all of this endless march into a technological future is actually choking us and destroying the other orders of creation, and that's a major preoccupation for global elites as well as people on low-lying islands. The threat from nanotechnology, which is a real one. We have a nanotechnology lab in Cambridge, and one of the things they factor in is the potential risk of having these invisible machines that replicate themselves, and how you then stop them replicating themselves. There's also clearly the artificial intelligence threat. does seem to be. There's an element of danger there. The Terminator scenario. It's almost the favorite trope of serious science fiction films now, when the machines take over as a kind of moral idea of a kind of updated Dr. Faustus and being taken over by our own demonic creations. Stephen Hawking in Cambridge said, we need to put the brakes on this before he died, because Lovelock, who produced the famous Gaia hypothesis, said in his last book, I think, the machines will take over, human beings will disappear, but this is just the next step in evolution, and why should our squidgy biology be the recipient of the brave new age? We should be happy that a new mechanical civilization is going to emerge, be better than us, and that's just how evolution works.
And that speaks to your concern about falling birth rates, because that's part of the evolution. The selfish gene will invent artificial intelligence, which will replace it one day.
So there is, from the kind of confused Muslim perspective, myself included, a sense that it's easier now to deal with the modern threats than it was in the time of Muhammad Abdal and Queen Victoria, when the dichotomy seemed very absolute, because modernity is now kind of turning on upon itself, deconstructing itself, worrying about itself. And if the world is going to come to an end, it won't be because of any world religion, it'll be because of modernity.
But that's the failure of modernity, or the shortcomings of modernity. What does Islam have to offer in this time?
Well, we would say that Islam offers a way of returning individually and ideally collectively to a form of life that holds things in balance, that isn't a kind of runaway collapse in the direction of inertia or the law of gravity. More and more stuff, more and more innovations, the latest iPhone, the latest, until the planet can't cope and we all start choking. That there is a principle of balance that's inherent in a traditional religious outlook. The fact that, and here it gets into the kind of specifics of the evolution of European Muslim thought, going back to the guy who kind of started it before the First World War, Ibn Agueli or Abdul Hadi Aqili, who is the first really to write in a sustained and reflective way about what it means to be a Muslim in the modern West, not as a kind of exotic seeker after Eastern wisdom, although that's not intrinsically a negative thing, but as somebody who seriously and reflectively thinks about Islam as preserving authentic forms that, in the degenerating secularity of an unhappy and increasingly violent Europe, enable people to keep hold of certain human universals. So, for instance, we get a kind of steady process of migration at the moment from people who are sick of the Protestant churches and like to see the Catholic Church as the repository of the Rock of Ages, of eternal truths, of a liturgy that never changes, whereas the Church of England is constantly updating and changing its ceremonies, and they think that can't be the repository of eternal truth. He's a kind of traditionalist. So they're migrating to Catholicism, but lo and behold, dear Pope Francis has banned the Latin Mass, effectively. And everybody has to worship according to this thing that was developed in the late 1960s. So then they move on sometimes to some of the Orthodox churches. And then they find that the Orthodox churches are inseparable in many cases from various nationalisms, because they're all national churches. Some of those people end their journey in Islam, because you can go into any church in England and the liturgy will be endlessly diverse and changing. The only thing you won't see is people praying the way Jesus of Nazareth prayed. It never occurs to them that might be an interesting thing to do, and it's constantly drifting and changing. And people move away from the church as a result, because they want something timeless, familiar, hieratic, dignified, sacred. You go into any mosque in England or anywhere in the world, and you know exactly what you're going to see. There's not going to be the imam with a guitar singing happily about something or other, or some weird thing that you might be annoyed by. It's just 4 rakahs for Zohar, and in no mosque anywhere in the world is it anything else. So people like Agueli and more recent sort of Muslim writers, Charles-André Gillis is a famous one in France, find that to be a sign of divine providence. And that's why so many of these Western philosophical types have treated Islam as a respectable refuge or lifeboat, because everything else seems to be kind of dissolving. It's Marx's observation that under conditions of late capitalism, everything solid melts into the air. Local languages decline, accents decline, customs decline, narratives, stories, everything becomes the homogenized market that the capitalist system requires in order to maximize profits. But the thing that hasn't melted into the air is what you see in mosques. Ramadan the same everywhere. So part of the appeal for these thinkers is Islam as a way of having some kind of normal life in the modern world, but having genuine access to the forms that emerge from a great age of faith that nobody in the immediate future is likely to be tampering with.
I've heard multiple times, Sheikh, that you remind all of us Islam is the only world religion where we pray the way our founder did. And
as far as I know, there may be smaller traditions.
Sure.
I don't really know what the Sikhs do, for instance. So in terms of major world religions, it's probably a fair statement, yeah.
And you position that as a way to manifest our repository of authenticity, Islam as that. At the same time, though, Islam has to exist in the contemporary moment.
Yep.
And I suppose to extend our discussion about how the confused Muslim or the confused non-Muslim in this age of secular crisis, how does one balance between the desire for authenticity, for tradition, and the appeal of Islam being the way it is, this ancient religion that hasn't changed in some very, very fundamental ways, never has and never will, with the need for Islam to engage with all those different things that you mentioned about, from climate crisis to human rights to all of these more modern constructs?
Well, there will be local answers and individual answers, and I think the mark of a major world religion is that it doesn't give you a single checklist of answers. The classical libraries of Islam, which I spend most of my waking life inhabit, present an ethico-legal vision which is very happy with diversity and plural opinions. Thomas Bauer, the German Orientalist, recently published a book called The Culture of Ambiguity, which has been done into English now. I think Columbia University Press brought it out last year, which is very interesting, but to the traditional Muslim, rather kind of obvious observation that in the pre-modern Islamic world, everybody was happy with the diversity of opinions. That you went to the madrasa in the Ottoman Empire or wherever, and you learnt that even within the Hanafi madhab, there might be 20 different views on something, and there is no requirement that you have one agreed response. And anybody who looks at traditional fatwa collections or works of Islamic law and ethics will recognize that it's a culture of ambiguity. And Bauer very tidily marks out the fact that they thought that was theologically appropriate. It's the inevitable consequence of the complexity of the revealed sources. The hadith in the Quran, they're not easy texts to get singular answers out of, apart from fundamental doctrinal things and basic things about how you pray. And so the idea was, amongst traditional scholars still is, that this sort of intricate family of different exegetic or interpretative styles is the way the religion is supposed to be. More recently, he says, from the 1850s onwards, Muslims, partly because of this kind of fearful reflex and the retreat into the idea that Islam should be an ideology and a single worldview and the Islamic answer to everything, the kind of Islamist approach, if you like, Muslims have been rather anxious about the traditional Sharia and its kind of openness that you find in the classical text, because they want the Islamic answer quickly because of their anxieties. So Bauer's book is very interesting in that. But if you return to the classical understanding of the Sharia, you will find that there is such a range of different expressions of wisdom, different interpretations of the sources, different ways of coping with the different challenges which the Muslim world has been through over its journey over the last 1,000 years and more, that within that diversity you can find the basis for what is going to happen anyway, which is the necessary diversity of Muslim responses to modernity. And there will be some things that Muslims will probably never be able to accommodate, like the otherkin movement, for instance, which is growing pace very rapidly in the United States, to some extent in England. We have otherkin students in Cambridge now, and we're not really going to classify them as whatever they think they're classified as. But in many other respects, I think that the Sharia provides a kind of large discursive family of responses that should be a very sound and successful basis for a divergent range of Muslim answers to modern challenges. I think the idea of a religion that has a single solution to every problem is a rather terrifying totalitarian approach, and one that certainly holds no charms for me.
Just sitting here listening to you, Shaykh, it feels like that last answer requires more Muslims to be curious about learning about these diverse answers. And I wonder if you worry that in the current moment there isn't that articulation of how diverse this answer can be, and that we should seek for that rather than seek for that singularity.
And this is particularly exacerbated by the fact that people have short attention spans and they tend to consume a lot of their religious information online. So
it depends who they listen
the
to.
scholar who says, on this issue of a particular form of birth control, for instance, the classical scholars have 32 different interpretations. Immediately click somewhere else, because who's going to listen to all of that? More attractive to the kind of teenage seeker is going to be the guy with the angry face who said, there's one view that's correct, everything else is haram. And in an age where people are looking for quick, easy solutions, unfortunately, the oversimplification of religion is what is prevailing. So we do need scholars who go back into the libraries and see what is the historical objective fact of Islamic ethico-legal discourse, which is that it is a family of disputations, a culture of difference, and that the scholars actually found strength in that, and a kind of cosmopolitan civility in their capacity to inhabit a world in which it was fine for people to hold their hands like this in prayer, hold their hands like that in prayer, or that. And it was kind of enjoyed as part of the richness of the Ummah's journey through debates and space and time.
The number of times in the masjid, someone will tell me that you're sitting wrong. Especially
your
when
hand should
we
be
were
a bit
young,
more,
when we were kids.
The only thing that's
There are
definitely
camps for
wrong
this.
in that situation is for them to be reproaching somebody.
Yeah.
Because unless they're the mufti of all muftis who knows every possible interpretation in classical fiqh, they should just zip it and just be a bit humble.
Shaykh, I want to round this section off before we go to the last segment on the Islamic tradition on individual and society. Now, I've heard you speak about the difference between duties and rights. How perhaps in the Islamic tradition, we speak more of one's duty, how one can contribute and be more useful to society than just what is owed to them. But with a lot of Muslims migrating to the West, in particular migration to Europe, there's almost, and I'm going to pose it something a little bit controversial here, there's almost a sense when they come into the Western society, they'll forget about their duties to society. They don't pull their weight. They stay away. They don't bother to integrate. And they become seduced by the notion of rights to say that, this is right, my right. This is, I'm here now and you owe something to me. Is that something that you've seen happen with Muslims who are now in the West?
I mean, it varies a lot. I think Muslim integration is stronger and more actual than a lot of people on any side of the political spectrum acknowledge. 30% of medium-sized businesses in London, for instance, now are Muslim-owned. 13% of National Health Service workers are Muslim. Those are spaces where everybody is cheek by jowl with everybody else. The idea of kind of triumphalist ghettos is not really accurate. What we saw in the riots that we had last summer was actually something quite interesting, which was that the riots emerged from the left behind Rust Belt working classes, which represent a much more segregated and non-integrated community than the Muslims do. The Muslims tend to have jobs, or they're engaging with local council, and whereas these sort of white working classes whose fathers were down the mines or building cars or making steel, and all of those industries have gone to Brazil or India or somewhere, and they're just on the dole with a very high degree of social fragmentation. that it's those communities actually that are the unintegrated communities in modern Britain, rather than some putative mass of Muslims, as if that was a category that meant anything, given that so many educational levels, class backgrounds, dozens of different linguistic origins. It's very hard to generalize about the British Muslim community.
That's in Britain, but the experience in Europe, for instance, banlieues in Paris, for instance, Turkish enclaves in Germany, these are more real, I think, examples of challenges in integrating.
Yeah, and the problem is that the countries with a stronger nationalistic party political orientation tend not to like to integrate people who aren't identical to themselves. And particularly the German sense of identity is you have to have German ancestry. You have to be part of the German story. And if your great-grandfather came from somewhere in Turkey, even if German is the only language you know and you're not doing Muslim things at all, they're still not considered to be German. The official term is German citizens of migratory origin. That's the state's definition of those people. They're not really considered to be German. And in France also, because of the conformism of French Republican values and the extreme fanaticism of some of the discourse that's taking place now. Alain Finkielkraut recently, is one of France's most popular intellectuals, said that hijab in schools is a surrender to Nazism. That's the kind of normal discourse that they have, an intense phobia. Anything that looks like Arab Islamic anything, they treat as a deliberate insult to the Republic. So this is secularity is a kind of religion. It's a kind of required ideology. And given that there's a kind of halitosis of hatred breathed against France's mainly sort of North African Muslim communities, it's difficult for them to get out of the ghettos sometimes. I've been to those places in the sort of Paris suburbs or of Lyon, and it's very hard for them to get jobs if their names are not French names. Sometimes I know Muslims who've changed their names to French names so that at least they'll be allowed for the interview. It's that intense. So to blame them for not integrating, why should they want to integrate with people who hate them and reject them?
Yeah.
It's not a meaningful demand. Having said that, there's plenty of exceptions and Muslims who are there, and I know Muslims who are craftsmen involved in the rebuilding of Notre Dame, for instance.
Look at the football team.
They're everywhere. Football, yeah, from Paul Pogba to whoever, yeah.
Benzema when he was playing, yeah.
Sport is often a way in which, because people want their team to win.
But it's almost they look away. I mean, it's just the exception, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the exception that proves the rule.
I mean, I would say that blame is on both sides, but in many European democracies, the chauvinism is so intense that it's mainly the fault of the host communities rather than the migrants.
For me, Sheikh, just before we wrap up this segment, I wanted to end with something a bit heavy, which is about nationalism, since we spoke about this last couple of minutes, and take it away from the West, but nationalism within Muslim countries or putatively Muslim countries, because in Malaysia and in other places where we are Muslim in majority speaking, there are anti-migrant and anti-foreign sentiments even when dealing with fellow Muslims. So I wonder whether you had something to say about how both overt religiosity in the case of Malaysia and sort of anti-migrant even for Muslim brothers can coexist. You wonder if that's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah, let's call it out. You're talking about people like Rohingyas,
Rohingyas,
right?
yeah.
Well, Islam is a religion which began in migration and in the accommodation of refugees. That's the whole story of the Hijrah. It's also the Abrahamic story. It is part of the honor of the traditional Muslim to be hospitable to the stranger. However, human beings are tribal because we're at ease with people who we can understand easily because they're like ourselves. That's a very kind of primordial instinct in Bani Adam, in Homo sapiens. Many of the Quranic teaching stories are a face-off between blind nationalism and tribalism on the one hand, and the unifying idea of all humanity as being in the image of God, sacred, and the equality of the believers. Historically, Muslim societies, although the religion's capacity to affirm identities is evident. So the Iranians became Muslim, but they developed their own culture, their own architecture. Their literature is really un-Arab in many ways. The same with the Turks and the West Africans and the North Indians and so forth. Local particularities in many ways were kind of enhanced by Islamization, which is a very interesting paradox, but demonstrable. If you go to the Islamic Arts Museum here in Kuala Lumpur, you'll see the difference, unity and diversity, that Islam touches a culture and it starts to thrive and flourish and do new things, but it's still itself. But at the same time, the traditional Muslim world was extremely cosmopolitan. There was a lot of intermarriage. If you go to Istanbul and you get anybody to take a DNA test, you won't find anybody who is pure Turkish. There'll be a mixture of Kurds and of Bosnians and of Armenians and of Arabs and of Jewish converts and everything. Muslim metropolitan cities were like that because there is nothing in Sharia that determines that your legal status or your ethical worth has anything to do with your ancestry. Nowadays, as Western-style nationalisms have been used sometimes in order to prop up faltering conceptions of national identity in the post-colonial period, sometimes that Islamic spirit of fraternity is lost sight of. And the world is sometimes shocked by, how many Syrian refugees were allowed into the Gulf countries, for instance, 10 years ago when Syria imploded. They had to go crawl across the minefields into Greece and then Macedonia and then try and get into Germany. And it was a nightmare hijrah for them away from the Dar al-Islam. This is really a very shaming thing. But the Islamic response is evident, that if they are your brothers, you have to take them in. You have to, it's the Muhajirin and the Ansar. This is a prophetic commandment. Iwa ul-Gharib, to grant refuge to the stranger is a very honorable thing. They are one of the 8 legitimate recipients of zakat, for instance. They're specifically given rights in Sharia. But unfortunately, the battle between tribalism and truth is ongoing.
And that's not even to touch about, we spoke about nationalism and tribalism, the house divided because of geopolitics. I think that's something that, we can spend a lot of time talking about. But we'll take a quick break and come back right after this.
Welcome back to Kindred Stories with Dr. Sheikh Hakim Murad. Sheikh, I think education is one of the topics that we said we wanted to speak about in this conversation. You founded the Cambridge Muslim College, but even before we go to that particular institution, maybe share a bit about, to the extent you're comfortable, your own personal journey throughout life and playing your role as a learned scholar, influencing and teaching people towards the deen. How important has education been in your own sort of self-image and your own journey?
Well, I am a student, I suppose, and I have the privilege of knowing Arabic and a few other languages, so I can engage directly with the great intellectual legacy of our heritage. Cambridge University Library with its 12 million books. Haven't got through 0.01% of them yet. It's just human heritage is such an inexhaustible treasure. But of course, one of the things that one asks oneself on this journey is, given that we are in an age of liquid modernity, as Zygmunt Bauman calls it, when all identities are collapsing, and even British identity is collapsing. And, 50 years ago, you could always tell an Englishman by the cut of his suit and by the kind of car he drove and the food he liked. And now it's kind of just part of the global grey goo of uniformity, that identities are collapsing with distressing speed. What does it mean at this time when historic identities are collapsing to complexify one's identity by giving one's allegiance to the worldview of Islam, which is historically quite far from what is conceived to be the European norm. And I think many sort of neo-Muslims experience their cultural sort of amphibiousness as something that's extraordinarily enriching, if complex, that it is no longer required to be a member of the Church of England in order to be fully English, but it's certainly not necessary to be an Arab or to be any other ethnicity in order to be fully Muslim. So the exploration of that overlap space is something that one finds endlessly fascinating. And one of the things that we do in Cambridge is to experiment with various cultural forms, such as the Cambridge Mosque, which is a sort of hybridized British mosque, without being too ideological and pedantic about it. But the brief for the architect was that it should be look like a British mosque. And he sort of scratched his head for some months trying to work out what that could possibly be, but he came up with a good solution. But also to experiment with various cultural forms, with various ways of expressing one's religious faith through singing, for instance, and poetry. You can see some examples on the website of the Cambridge New Mosque, to see ways in which traditional English tonalities and rhythms, folk songs and so forth can be converted, as it were, for Muslim purposes, and what actually happens when you're listening to something that really sounds as if it came out of 18th century Bedfordshire, but actually it's about the Holy Prophet. I quite like these juxtapositions and these attempts to overcome supposed binaries. I'm a believer in mixed marriages, cross-fertilization, the creation of a new energy by getting different DNA strains of cultures to interlock and to kind of be amused by each other to see what happens.
But speaking to that binary dichotomy that you mentioned, I just wanted to read a quote from you, attributed to you at least. Western knowledge is purely instrumental, rooted in a reductionist theory of the world which holds that through the manipulation of matter, human beings may become happier and better. Islamic institutions never generated the worldview which is leading to this competitive denuding of the earth's resources and creating a culture of increasingly fragmented selves and families. I mean, I felt a bit inadequate reading that. Shara and myself both educated in the Western tradition,
exactly
went to
the
UK
thing.
universities.
Believing in linear progress.
Absolutely. I mean, the end of history, the linear progress. And we've never had the opportunity to spend any meaningful time in institutions like Azhar, or even the Cambridge Muslim College, at least in having formal instruction. So with that, is this dichotomy in education between the Western tradition, Islamic tradition, is that something that cannot be reconciled in the manner that you spoke of, trying to mix things together?
Well, neither Islam nor the West are single things. They are complex, quarrelling families of rival but kindred interpretations. There are ways of being militantly secular and reductionist in the West, which has absolutely no space for any sort of talk of the sacred. But there are also ways of being complexly religious and secular, which particularly the kind of Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is relatively unideological and quite empirical and just looking for what seems to work, rather than the kind of French Republic's idea of everything coming from a particular philosophical fountainhead, which actually makes it relatively easy in the Anglo-Saxon educational environment to propose sometimes untidy forms of hybridization that reduce this tiresome binary that many Muslims have bought into, which is that it's a zero-sum game. Islam and the West, the clash of civilizations, Pharaoh and Moses, light and darkness, which is a kind of Islamist idea, which you find in Sayyid Qutb and other kind of crude demonizings of Western culture, and which has to take into account the fact that very much is wrong in the House of Islam as well. And that there are certain institutions and the rule of law. You look at the the retirement of the resignation of the British minister last month as a result of something that she might have said 10 years ago, or the fact that she hadn't declared some use of her work phone. And these are very commendable. And you wouldn't find a minister resigning in many Muslim governments because of something that seems to be quite forensic and small like that. So there is much that is of genuine moral interest and integrity in the Western world that Muslims need to train up to. So I don't see it in terms of a kind of simple Iron Curtain binary at all. And the work that I try to do endeavours to use the English language and some of its assumptions and categories in order to see what happens when you try and be Islamic in that space. I don't believe in creating an incomprehensible dialect of Islam. I think that we need to inhabit the English language, the forms of the West as much as we can, without compromising on core religious beliefs and without hybridizing. And the miracle is that Islam in its core practices, as we discussed earlier, has survived the test of time. That you go into a mosque and what you see is what you see everywhere else in the world, and exactly what you would have seen 1,000 years ago in Cordoba or Baghdad. That's an enormous civilizational achievement. So I don't buy into the kind of what went wrong Bernard Lewis idea that the Muslim world is a kind of the roadkill of history, as one American politician described it. In religious terms, it's an enormous success story. Not only are people still maintaining these forms, but in huge numbers.
Fastest growing.
The new mosque in Cambridge is kind of overcrowded, so we have to have 2 Friday prayers, one after the other, and 200 or more conversions every year, and it looks like a very successful religious community. There are now more Muslims praying on Fridays than there are Anglicans praying on Sundays in the UK. That doesn't look like a religion in crisis.
But to the point that I was trying to raise, Sheikh, which is what would the ideal, I mean, again, loosely using the word ideal, education system for a Muslim be today?
Well, education is not just about the inculcation of facts. It is also about the refinement of character. Not so much in the contemporary secular world, where they teach things like citizenship, but it's quite attenuated, and in the absence of a consensus over what is the philosophical or religious source of virtue anyway, they tend not to go there. So one would like to see religion, and perhaps not just Islam, as furnishing the indispensable grounds for belief in virtue. One would like also to see ways in which institutions of sacred learning could emerge, which are, as it were, mystical, rooted in the Sufi traditions, rather than simple sort of replications of the madrasa system. Because one thing that we've lost in the Islamic world, and one reason for so many crises, is that historically you had the madrasa across the road, you had the zawiyah, the khanaqah, the tekke, whatever it was, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them everywhere. But those institutions have almost entirely vanished. So Al-Azhar still exists, but you walk around the streets of Cairo and the old lodges where the inner illumination was taught are all in ruins, or they've been turned into something else, or they're being squatted in by recent migrants from the countryside. And everywhere that infrastructure has vanished. So if you are talking about the creation of an Islamic pedagogy in the Western situations, ideally it should not just be places for the study of Islamic theology and law and ethics and tafsir and hadith and those things, although that's necessary. But there should also be centers for the cultivation of the sciences of the soul. And I think we've hardly started on that, partly because the people who've come to the Western world from the Islamic world have almost forgotten that they used to have those institutions as well. It's time out of mind.
In the same spirit of being anti-binary and being comfortable with hybridizing without compromising, obviously, I noticed that with the institution that you founded, there is a program, or there is an annual visit to the Vatican. I wanted to open that up as a point of discussion. How much is it important for Islam to engage with other faiths as allies, really, in this response to the secular crisis that we talked about, education-wise?
Yeah. I mean, the Quran itself, interestingly, mandates discussion with the Ahl al-Kitab And it says, do not speak with them except billati hiya ahsan, in the most excellent and beautiful way. And we know that the Holy Prophet had his engagements, his dialogues with the Bishop of Najran and other Christian delegations who came to see him. So it's not controversial that one can do that or should do that. It's part of our inculturation of our sort of trainee imams at the Cambridge Muslim College that we expose them to the religious story of Britain, which is primarily but not exclusively a Christian story. And so we do quite a few visits, not just overseas, but to Canterbury, for instance, to visit different Christian denominations. The rabbi comes and talks to them about Judaism. And we do have as the kind of treat at the end of our academic year where we take our trainee imams to the Vatican. We stay in either the Irish College or a monastery. And sometimes there's a papal audience. And they get to see how trainee Catholic priests are taught to deal with many of the same issues of modernity that Muslims are confronting, to do with the loss of identity, alternative sexualities, climate change, the rise of nationalism, the technologizing of human life. All of these big issues are actually shared amongst trainees in many world religions. It's often very good for our young imams, who sometimes feel in a rather insular environment, to see that they have a lot in common with people who they might not have imagined existed before they went. So it's an important part of the training. And generally our sort of Catholic friends there are very hospitable, and they let us into the bits of Rome that the tourists don't see. So last summer we went down in underneath St. Peter's into the ancient catacombs. And because it's kind of cramped and a bit claustrophobic, and the ancient paintings, because it's pre-Christian stuff down there, tend not to like a lot of humidity from people breathing. It was quite a privilege to be able to go down and see what's underneath St. Peter's. So it's a good exercise in mutual hospitality between the traditions, and everybody is enriched, I think, by that and made a bit more mature.
I wanted to ask you about Cambridge Muslim College now, and what your hopes are for the institution. Clearly, the way the programs are run, from what you've said here, but also what I've read from the website and online, is quite unique experience. And would you venture so far as to say that it is trailblazing in the sense of contemporary Muslim education that is fit for the times?
It's fantastic application for you to spend some time there.
Yeah, that too.
Direct to the founder.
We might even give you a discount on your fees.
Thank you.
It's an interesting challenge, and it's partly because my experience of inhabiting the so-called clash of civilizations overlap zone is that actually it's great fun to get the two worlds to talk to each other and see where they understand and where they don't understand each other and what they can learn. And I find it a kind of blessed encounter to overcome the unnecessary divergences. The curriculum, which is primarily designed for people who've been to madrasas and traditional, what's called Darul Ulum Muslim seminaries in England, of which there's about 40 now. They come to Cambridge, girls as well as boys, and we give them a kind of total immersion experience in the challenging discourses of modernity. So a molecular biologist comes along and talks about neo-Darwinism. Somebody talks about nanotechnology. The rabbi talks about Orthodox Judaism. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop, comes and talks about C.S. Lewis. And it's quite a good opportunity for them not to hear about modernity at third hand through somebody's not quite accurate khutbah on YouTube, but actually to talk to the people themselves. And Cambridge is where we're at. So we have access to an unrivaled range of human resources, people who can cycle over. And often the academics are very interested to talk to our kids because it's a kind of new experience for them. So, but the point of the program is that we don't tell them what the correct Muslim response to any particular modern challenge ought to be. But we rather explain what is the nature of the challenge, explain that actually modernity has its own internal differences and arguments, and it's not the kind of monolithic Aqidah type challenge that some Muslims suppose it to be, and that it's actually kind of fun talking about different ways in which the ulama, Muslim thinkers, And others have attempted to juggle these questions. So we put them in a space where they can safely ask questions and be enriched, but without expecting that they all become kind of cookie cutter, identikit, contemporary imams as a result.
But what have some of the transformative impact been of these individuals who are educated in the tradition, in the madrasas, going to Cambridge Muslim College, meeting with people, talking about modernity, challenges of modernity, science. What have you seen in terms of the endpoint? Have they become more engaging with their community, more open with their community, contributing towards a more open worldview amongst Muslim communities in the UK?
The problem that we have, which triggered the whole experiment 15 years ago of creating this college in Cambridge, is that even though most Muslims are pretty well advanced in the process of coping with modern European life and getting jobs and paying their taxes and just being part of the real world, the message from the pulpits, the minbars, is often lagging behind. And the imams don't really get the younger generation in particular, and feel sometimes that they have a kind of complex, an inferiority complex, because they don't really get the young people. And you can see this if you go to the wedding sermon at many traditional Muslim weddings in England, where the imam, the Maulvi, gives a little talk, and all the young people are kind of in stitches of laughter because it's so inappropriate and so gender hierarchical and so out of order that it kind of makes things worse rather than brings them closer to the religion. So there's a kind of crisis amongst the religious leadership. So what we find once these young people come and we've processed them a little bit is that they actually gain a lot in confidence, that this inferiority complex vanishes because they find that they can talk, at least generally, about climate change and nanotechnology and AI and so forth. They don't feel disenfranchised. They can walk past churches and they know the difference between the Presbyterian church and the Methodist church, whereas most trainee imams in England haven't got a clue about anything Christian. So it's a way of enfranchising them by giving them, a basic understanding of the environment in which they're going to work. For the first month or so, they're usually quite gobsmacked and silent. And then they kind of see the point of it, and they realize that it actually is going to actually enhance their ability to teach the stuff that they've learnt at the madrasa, because they can see how it fits with the modern environment. And we lose very few students. Occasionally they drop out, but generally they're highly motivated. And another thing we've discovered is that actually the madrasa training, even though it seems to be from another world and another kind of time frame, is actually rather a good basis for their formation, because it has they have a strong awareness of the ethical traditions of Islam. They're very courteous people. They listen respectfully. They work hard. And when at the end of the year they do make little speeches at the Vatican or something, I put them on the spot and I say, okay, you've never been outside Lancashire before, except for your Umrah. Now you're in Rome. And here is a bunch of ambassadors and priests, and I'd like you to talk about what you've learnt and your sense of identity in this strange space. Usually they do very well. They speak very well, very much from the heart, very impressively, and they're able to deploy things that they know, because most of them are Hafiz, they've memorized the Quran, things that they knew but in a sense didn't know that they knew. So they have this enormous body of wisdom and knowledge, and now they're able to pick and choose from that repository in ways that they couldn't before. So it kind of enfranchises them, but also I think is a kind of vindication even of the madrasa system, as long as it's understood as the kind of rock-solid foundation for more contextualizing and contemporary work later on.
Will you do this for imams or trainee imams, or are you doing this for imams and trainee imams from other parts of the world?
Well, we're very small. It's a kind of boutique college. We've got, depending on how you tot them up, about 60 students at the moment. So we're kind of a minnow next to the whale of the University of Cambridge. But insofar as we now have the curriculum and the resources and the teaching expertise and the networks in order to keep it going, we're hoping that we will slowly grow. For various reasons involving Home Office bureaucracy, we're not able to give visas to overseas students at the moment. We have to be quite a bit bigger to do that. But we know that some of our graduates have gone on to open analogous institutions elsewhere. So one of them, for the last 6 or 7 years, has been running a little similar college in Melbourne, Australia, for his community. Another one, a lady, has opened a little sort of Quran school and sort of contemporary Islamic studies center in a town in Canada. I met another, actually, CMC graduate yesterday who happens to be in KL at the moment, very much enjoying his stay, who has a kind of online program. So with each of the good graduates, there's a kind of exponential effect that they then go on to repeat the message. But in terms of expanding ourselves, it's just limitations of funding, because we don't get money from any government. We're a charity. We're completely independent of anybody who might want to pull any strings. And donors have to be aware that it's unconditional. And that really restricts the pace of our growth.
Sheikh, your teachings and your videos are viewed millions of times around the world. One of my final questions here, to the extent you're comfortable in answering, what kind of legacy do you see yourself leaving, if you even think in those terms? I wouldn't be surprised if you don't.
Well, everything that happens in the modern world is so unexpected and unprecedented that you can't really imagine where we'll be even in 5 years' time. What I hope people, especially young people, will learn, the fundamental moral of the story, is that they should relax a little bit. Islam is not this kind of strict ideological, shame-inducing totalitarian thing that some would like them to believe. But if you go to the classical sources and the traditional scholars, you find it extremely gracious, extremely forgiving, extremely humane, that God is merciful, that he created the world out of his mercy, that every enraptured soul who has had a mi'raj, as it were, and encountered the divine, has come back saying what is there is perfect love, compassion, purity, forgiveness, perfection. So the way of dealing with the anxieties of the modern age, I think, is to remember that the basic message of religion is that everything is what the Rahman is doing. Things are basically all right. Islam is there to make your life easier. Allah is not out to catch you out. Just kind of chill out a little bit and don't make religion this anxious intensity. It's there to be beautiful and to make you beautiful. I hope that the college, whatever its future might be, will continue to remember this rather uncontroversial Islamic insight.
Sheikh, for me, my last question is, I think, something personal, but something that I've heard you speak about and something that you spoke about earlier in this conversation, which is the science of the soul. I've tried to be a more observant, better Muslim when it comes to the mandatory requirements, the rituals. I try to be khushu in my prayer. One thing that you've spoken of is tafakkur, and to contemplate in the moment, hadir, be present in the moment, and something that young people, be in the moment now. But how do we contemplate in the moment with the divine? And this is also a verse that you refer to, which is, to Allah belongs the east and the west. So wherever you turn your face, there will be the face of Allah. Yep. How can I enhance the science of my soul, Sheikh?
We might need another few hours in order to get me going on that. I'm not sure that I have straightforward answers, but in terms of being in the moment, there was a very famous Scottish Sheikh Abdal Ross, who died about 30 years ago, who used to say, try and realize that every moment is equivalently marvelous. Though we might think that certain things are kind of mediocre and mediated and grey, but actually everything is simply what God is doing. And the science of being in the moment is the science of seeing the wonder of things, which is easier if you're in sort of the Belum rainforest and everything is extraordinary
concrete
and
jungle,
inspires.
you know.
Yeah, in the concrete jungle, it's more of a challenge. But everything is still what God is doing, even if human beings have made it a bit mediocre. But still, it is God's action. The fact of time, the fact of being in time, the fact of the rolling of the planet beneath our feet, the fact of everything is a wonder. And even if you're, say, at the departure lounge of some average airport and everything is exactly like every other airport, everything in the world, and there's nothing wonderful at all, just cultivate the ability to look for what's wonderful. Look for some mother looking after her child. Look for somebody who's helping some old person. Even look for some terrified and oppressed pot plant in the corner of the airport that's still a living thing. But train your soul to look for beauty. And then you'll start to experience something of the amazingness of the moment. But don't just say, oh, one day I'll have this religious experience when I'm with my true love standing on a beach looking at the sunset and I'll have my epiphany then. It can be in any moment. Because God is always Al-Qarib, the near. He's never distant. We're kind of all over the place. But his closeness is perfect and absolute at all times. And half closing one's eyes and being aware of the delicious improbability of things is half of the religious journey. The humorousness of the improbability of things, which our saints in Islam have always played on. The laughter of the child when it sees a duck for the first time, that's how we should be. It might seem naive, childlike, innocent, but that's probably how we should be. Adults are too jaded. We need to get back to that childlike sense of wonder and amazement at the sheer fact of being, which shouldn't be difficult to connect with because we're in the middle of it after all.
Yeah.
What a way to end the year.
Yes, definitely. Shaykh, maybe just one more, if you don't mind, KJ.
Go ahead.
Mortality. And trying to wrap my head around what you just said in terms of being aware of the wondrousness of the world.
Yep.
As one goes through life and becomes closer and closer to the end, and sees members of one's family also pass on, this discussions and this awareness becomes all the more important. I wonder if you could close our discussion by saying something about how mortality becomes only a step in the overall journey once you accept what life actually is and what the purpose of life is.
Because I think just to tag along, we become obsessed with eschatology, trying to figure out how it all ends, what happens after this.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, we're going to get there anyway, when we will have a clearer sense of what it is than we can imagine now. I was saying this morning that our perception of what awaits us beyond the curtain of death is about as accurate as the fetus in the womb hearing things and seeing lights about this world. It kind of can speculate and conjecture in its kind of baby-like pre-language state. But when it gets into the world, it thinks, oh, this is weird. And that's how we all be. That there are intimations in this world. And those intimations take the form of, well, anything that is beautiful, anything that has the breath of the sacred to it, that when we are in the presence of holiness, in a sacred place, or a sacred glade in the forest, or with holy people, what we inhale, what we are radiated by in that presence is a genuine intimation. It's a fragrance of paradise. But those Muslims who try to either put the end times in their diary because they think they've seen the signs of the end of time and it's all about the internet, and they forget the fact the Holy Prophet didn't know when the end times would be, and he said this explicitly. And being too literal-minded about what the soul is when it's beyond this state. Who knows? Who knows? But we are told that it is a consequence of what we have made the soul in this life, because that's the divine justice. We build that future. That if we turn the soul into a furnace of desires and envy and criticism and covetousness and the fiery thing, that's what it will feel when it's in the eternal abode, eternal clocks have stopped ticking, but eternal. We try to conceptualize that. If the heart has been watered with the dhikr of reflection, purity, we always look to see what is best and in every situation, and we are gravitated towards beauty, and we are naturally repelled from ugliness, then we are building a garden within ourselves, this rawda, which is going to extend itself and find its full archetypal form after life. So if we kind of build it for ourselves in the heart, except that we're told that God's mercy means that we get much more than we deserve. And people come out of hell into heaven, but nobody ever goes the other way. That's in the hadith. This is the divine rahmah, which is just as well, considering what a mess we make of what's in there. It's just as well.
Subhanallah. Dr. Timothy Winter, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, thank you so much, sir, for spending a bit of time with us in Kindred Stories. May Allah bless all your endeavors and also the success of the college. And please continue to illuminate the Muslim world with your knowledge and with insights on how we can become more virtuous Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, and many blessings for you, for this exercise, and for all the people of Malaysia, inshallah.
Thank you.